You know, niggas gotta get their priorities together. Got their mind on the wrong things, spending their money in the wrong way.
Trapaholics, real trap shit.
Say you need that car with the rims and a charm, just like Jim. It's more than life. Yeah.
I'm telling you. Talk to him.
Say you need that LV bag with the belt and the hat.
That's all you got though.
It's more than life. Yeah.
Talk to him. Real.
Say you wanna turn up at the club, buy some bottles, impress them girls. It's more than life.
Fucking everybody.
Yeah.
Damn, son, where'd you find this?
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Saints and Appetizers podcast and Food App. And we have quite a bit of news here, Saints news for the main course, kind of a recap of everything from last week. Lot of news about, I guess, the end of training camp and some transactions that the Saints made during that time. But anyways, let's get right into this right now. So can I get a menu? And the first thing, been talking about Michael Thomas, and before we talk about Michael Thomas, which I hardly ever mention him, so this will be kind of funny to talk about. But first thing I want to get to is I just want to shout out this person again for subscribing to the channel. I know he subscribed a little while back, and I haven't done any Saints-related videos in a while, so I'm not sure if he was a UFC, more of a fan of my channel for the UFC, or more a fan for the Saints news. So I figured I'd give him a shout out on both. But I just want to shout out Uip at IO. I appreciate appreciate that you subscribed. To any other listeners out there, if you haven't subscribed yet, I'd appreciate it. I appreciate anything from likes, comments, subscribes, shares, anything like that. I appreciate it. But if I can call you out, you have a YouTube channel yourself, I'll give you a shout out. But anyways, I really appreciate all that. So anyway, before I forgot to do that, and then remembered to do that before I was going to get on the first subject here, I wanted to get to Michael Thomas. So I really don't ever talk about him, really. I won't start talking about him until, heck, he probably plays half the season, without injury, because he's just kind of like an extra, an extra side, a specialty, like if the Saints get him this season and he's healthy, it's kind of just like a cherry on top. So I don't really want to talk him up or put a lot of weight and relying on Michael Thomas too much, because I think doing that and going into the season like that for this would be like the third year in a row, relying on Michael Thomas as being like your best offensive weapon or just best player in general. But what I wanted to say about Michael Thomas, just because I think this stuff's kind of fun, is he was at like all the mandatory mini camp. He pretty much all of it was just working off to the side, kind of running, I don't even know what you would say, like quarter speed routes, not even really running at all, and just kind of going through the motions and then working off to the side with Derek Carr, which that was great to see when he was going through his ankle and toe injuries and all that the last two seasons. You didn't see any Michael Thomas doing the workouts and training and OTAs and in training camp. You just saw some of his own like Instagram footage of him running 40-yard dashes and stuff like that, just running straight lines. But it's good to see him. And on top of seeing him, that was another thing he really didn't do, is he didn't really talk to the media or anything like that all that much. And he's been doing that after practices. And that's what I kind of wanted to get to, is I'm not the only person that thought this, but when I saw him, I thought his belly belly kind of sticking out. He's looking like Michael Thomas getting a little bit fat, and I mean that's understandable for a guy that's had so many foot and ankle and toe injuries. He can't work out as much as he could in prior years. I guess that would have been back in 2016, but he's looking a little hefty. Looks like he may have been uh, borrowing the diet plan or the cook from Zion Williamson or something. But then I heard, I guess it was name drop a couple times on this podcast, but heard from New Orleans Saints podcast, New Orleans football podcast from Nick Underhill. He said that he had seen him without his shirt on, and it looked like he just had he had like a 6-pack, 8-pack still, but it just looked like they were huge muscles. And I've seen this before in some of my friends, that used to be in the military and stuff or the Marines, and you can still have a 6-pack or an 8-pack on top of a beer belly. So just because it looks like he still has a 6-pack, that doesn't mean that he's not a little overweight. Doesn't mean that he just has the biggest abdominal muscles in the world. But because it looks, if I was to guess how much he weighs right now, I would say he probably weighs like 230 pounds, because Michael Thomas is what, 6'3", and used to, like, his prime playing weight back in 2016 when he caught 150 footballs, he was like probably 215, 6'3", 215. He looks like he's about 15 pounds overweight, about 230, and Michael Thomas, he was never really a burner, someone that was going to beat you with speed anyways, but still, he did the most with what he had. But you taking more away from that, I would be surprised if he ends up still looking like that. He has more of a body type like Juwan Johnson before he transitioned to tight end. So we'll hope that he can at least shed a little weight. Maybe 5-10 pounds would be good. But regardless of that, it's nice seeing him out there. It's not nice seeing him out there, seeing him talking. Says that he loves Derek Carr, and Derek Carr says he loves that guy. So there's some continuity there. Some relationship. That's kind of what you want to build up with your receivers. Let's see here. So that's enough of Michael Thomas for now. The next thing is we'll still be on wide receivers, because we're still talking about wide receivers, and we're talking about how the depth. I've been talking about, or people out there were starting to get kind of happy about the depth. There would be some people saying like, oh, you got Rashid Shaheed coming into his second year, you got Chris Olave, who's coming into his second year, who some people thought could have been offensive rookie of the year. You're getting dedicated and devoted Michael Thomas back. A lot of people were talking about, oh man, the depth there at wide receiver starting to kind of look nice, but then those same people would argue like, we already have Michael Thomas, we already have Rashid Shaheed, we already have Chris Olave. We don't need to make the trade for Hunter Renfrow. Like our depth is on lock, but all that can change pretty fast because this. I'm trying to think. I think Rashid Shaheed went out like the last day of voluntary OTAs. I think. I don't know. I know these dates probably aren't exactly right, but it seemed more like that. These injuries between these two players, Chris Olave and Rashid Shaheed, were spread out by a couple of days. But Rashid Shaheed, just say that it was one of the last days of mandatory OTAs. He's got a groin injury now, so he's out with every time Dennis Allen says it's minor, it's nothing to be worried about. But they've said that the whole time when Michael Thomas was dealing with his foot and ankle injury, or saying that he'd be back in 2 weeks from a toe, and then the next thing he went those whole 4 weeks with a dislocated toe. So I don't know what you want to call it. It's probably PTSD just from the last 2 seasons from all the injuries they've had. So you go from having Chris Olave, Rashid Shaheed, a fat Michael Thomas, but Rashid Shaheed's out. with a groin injury, which if anyone knows or has followed the sport or is an athlete themselves, that can be such a nagging injury. They say it's a slight groin strain, whatever the heck that means. He has a groin. So, there you lose one of your three starters if you're calling your two outside receivers and whoever your slot receiver is uh, the starter. So you have a starter sitting out, something that's supposedly minor. But then I think this was a couple days before the end of mandatory OTAs. Chris Olave is now out. He's out, and his is a little more concerning to me because I've heard stories, kind of like with KD, Kevin Durant. His is a slot. I can't remember what they worded it as. They worded it as an Achilles strain or something like that or soreness. That does not sound good to me because if you follow NBA at all, that was what uh, that's kind of what happened to Kevin Durant in the playoffs that one year. Is they said he came into the game dealing with a calf strain, and then he plays throughout the game and he ends up tearing his entire Achilles on the same leg. So an Achilles injury, strain, or soreness or anything, it can go from that with your Achilles to a completely ruptured or popped Achilles. So hearing Chris Olave now is out with a strained Achilles, and you got Rashid Shaheed with his groin, and then of course your flat Michael Thomas. But they just like the Rashid Shaheed injury, they said it wasn't anything to worry about. It's just minor. But I don't think there's any such thing as a minor Achilles injury. Let's just put it like that. But they said all these things are minor. But with saying those things are minor, they go out and they sign two wide receivers. Maybe these guys are just camp bodies, not really sure, but they obviously those injuries are something because they went out and signed two guys, but they may just be camp bodies, but they went out and these are guys that they had in previously for like practice, tryouts, OTA tryouts, and that's Lynn Bowden and Kiki Cutie. They had them for workouts on last Thursday and cut them and signed them a couple days later. And let's see, the Patriots had cut Bowden on May 10th, and he remained a free agency sent. And then the Raiders made him, and he was a third round pick in 2020. And then let's see, Kiki Cutie, that's the name that was more recognizable to me than Lynn Bowden. I'll admit I never heard of Lynn Bowden, but I had heard of Kiki Cutie before. He's kind of, wouldn't say like he's a great receiver, but he was a good like second option when he was with the Houston Texans. I remember him with DeAndre Hopkins and what is his name? I always forget his name. The speed receiver for them. I can't remember what his name is. He played for the Panthers last year. He changed his name to like Hope or Passion or something like that. But anyways, Kiki Cutie, he was the fourth round pick of the Houston Texans in 2018, and then he was with the Indianapolis Colts and in 2022, where he didn't really do anything. And the receiver I was thinking of that Kiki Cutie had played alongside of was Robbie Anderson, and he changed his name to like Passion or something. But yeah, in his first 3 years with Houston, first 3 years he averaged about 35 catches and 300 yards while he was with Houston. see what it says. Yeah, he totaled 941 receiving yards, 83 receptions, and 4 touchdowns with Houston Texans, and that was about 40, 41 yards a game. And then he didn't really do nothing the last 2 years with Indianapolis Colts. But I was interested in this when I saw the name because I recognize Kiki Cutie, and he's still young, only 26. Will be 27 in January, so this is kind of interesting. See, he returned punts. Yeah, he returned like 17 punts for the Colts last year. That's all he really did for them. He was just kind of a return man for them. But definitely something to keep an eye on. If the Saints are signing wide receivers off the street for insurance policies for the injuries that Rashid Shaheed and Chris Olave are dealing with, it's just something to keep an eye on. But on top of that, on top of the signing of Lynn Bowden, and Kiki Cutie, they also went and signed Billy Price. And when they were having him in for his OTA tryouts and stuff like that, I like that. I wanted them to sign him, and not only because he's been a starter the majority of his career with Cincinnati Bengals, where he was drafted 21st overall in 2018, but he also played at Ohio State. So he's like the 8th Ohio State player on this team. You could call this the New Orleans Buckeyes with how many former Ohio State players that are on this team. So when they originally were having him in for a tryout, I knew that there was probably like no way that they didn't sign him just because of the fact that he's a veteran. He's got a very seasoned player with a lot of starting experience. He started 45 games in his career, and I just knew with how the Saints have kind of dealt with injuries at the center position and on the interior. Eric McCoy, he missed 5 games in 2021 and 4 in 2022, so he's been injured the last 2 years. And then you got Cesar Ruiz as well, who has kind of serves as the backup for him. But hell, he's coming off of a Liz Frank injury. I think Cesar Ruiz and Trevor Penning just a couple of days ago had like hardware removed from their foot, so it's just a procedural surgery that they both had. So your backup for Eric McCoy is like your right guard starter who's coming off an injury. So it was just I like this. Out of the 3 signings that they made between Lynn Bowden, Kiki Cutie, I like the Billy Price signing the most. And I would guess that out of all these players, that Billy Price probably is who has the best chance of starting out of the 3 players that were signed recently. I could see him probably starting due to injuries on the offensive line. I could see him being a starter at center 1 or 2 games this upcoming season, or see him start at guard or something. But he's a Saints now. He was originally signed off the Raiders practice squad last year after Rodney Hudson injury to his knee, and Price started 11 games for them. So it's not like he just started, for the majority, like the first 4 years of his career with the Bengals, and then had been kind of jumping around. Like he jumped right into being another starter. Basically, went from practice squad to being starter, and that's kind of funny there that you see Rodney Hudson as the starter for the Raiders there. He went from being on the Raiders practice squad to the Cardinals practice squad, and I think Rodney Hudson was originally a Cardinal. Yeah, so they kind of swapped centers there. Yeah, Rodney Hudson last couple of years. Yeah, so Rodney Hudson was the center for the uh, for the Raiders from 2015 to 2020. So they got so the Arizona Cardinals basically stole another center from the Raiders with that signing. But I like all of those signings. I particularly like the Kiki Cutie and Billy Price signing. Out of the two, those are the two that probably have the best chance. And out of just those two, I would imagine Billy Price has the best chance. All right. So on to a little more of the talks of OTAs and upcoming training camp. And this I'll also have another note drop from New Orleans football podcast as well on this because they talked about this as well. But this is Ted Ginn was around OTAs and is expected to be a coach at training camp, and I like that. I like it when they bring in ex-Saints. Because he was it was really just the 2018 season when Ted Ginn was really good. He had like one of his best seasons that year. But Ted Ginn kind of holds a warm spot in my heart, kind of, because he was good that 20. It was actually the 2017 season, but it was the 2018 season where he caught like a big pass at the end of that Rams Saints NFC Championship game that put them in field goal range, and then of course a few plays later, you're getting the the pass interference on Ted Tommy Lee Lewis shortly after that. But he made a play during the playoffs that year in 2018 that should have went down in Saints history for getting them to another Super Bowl. So having him in is nice. Be interesting to see what he can provide to some of these young receivers. And I mean, his Ted Ginn Senior was a longtime coach, so he should have someone to look up to or ask questions to when it comes to coaching these wide receivers, because that's how Ted Ginn kind of got into the game, was through his son or his father. And so we have an ex-Saint coming in, and then we have an ex-Saint going out. So shortly after Ted Ginn was brought into OTAs and invited to training camp, Sterling Moore is out, and that's why I was going to talk about New Orleans football podcast is that Nick Underhill on there was talking about how great Sterling Moore had looked during like OTAs, and how he looked more like a player, looked just in as good a shape as any of the players or DBs out there. And he shortly goes from saying that to next thing you know, Sterling Moore is being released from the coaching staff. So it's funny how you can go from talking up a coach or a player and how good they look, and it's funny just because it's a coach is out there making himself kind of making a name for himself, or making himself more noticed than the players, because he's out there covering wide receivers and showing defensive backs to how to jam, and the next thing you know, he's out of there. You get a little good praise, and the next thing you know, you're out the door. I would definitely say that Sterling Moore doesn't hold a sweet spot in my heart like some of these, especially definitely not like Traquan Smith. Those years, I'm trying to think of the years that he played for the Saints between like 2014, 2016, somewhere around that time. He was like maybe a starter across from Delvin Breaux, and it was some hard times when Sterling Moore was what had to be a starter for the Saints. And you know, I don't have any hate towards him trying to prosper his career or anything. So hopefully, if he really does like coaching, hopefully he can get on somewhere else for some team, or maybe later on the Saints can bring him back. But that was a kind of an interesting coach swap there. So you're going to Ted Ginn Jr., I would say more of a beloved player and more of a player that has like history of coaching, just in his father's background. So it'd be nice to see what comes of that, and if Ted Ginn can teach these guys, any of these young receivers, anything that they can use to grow on. All right. So that's kind of a little bit of there's a little bit of mix up with practice squad camp body guys, and there's a little bit mix up change up between some kind of bottom tier coaches as well, guys trying to make a name for themselves. All right. And let's see, the last thing I'm talking about. I don't really care that much uh, about like rankings and things like that. National media always comes out with these rankings for different positions or different coaches, or completely, the defense or the offense, rankings. But this is the off season. This is the dead period. There's not a whole lot to talk about. So, PFF, Pro Football Focus, they're one of your main leaders in rankings and statistics and things like that. So not that long ago, I think just 3 or 4 days ago, that they released their rankings for wide receiving corps, and yeah, the Saints didn't do all that great on their ranking list. So when I opened this link to this, I knew that there had already been some people kind of talking about it, fans of different organizations, talking bad about it or talking good about it. And man, when I opened this link, I kept scrolling and scrolling and scrolling, and couldn't find the Saints, at first. And I scrolled all the way to the bottom and was like, oh, they're not at the bottom, so I must have missed them. And then I had to scroll again. See, had to go a little slower scrolling because I thought they'd probably be like maybe in the top 15, and then once I got past 15, I was like, man, whoever did this article, Trevor Skrina, uh, did this article, must dislike the Saints, because so I kept scrolling down and had to go a little slower, and they ended up being at 21. But this is what they had to say here is that he thinks he might be one of the few, but he still believes in Michael Thomas. Thinks he still has plenty left in the tank. Saints receiving core, a solid one to bet on. Thomas played just three games last year and missed all of 2022 due to injury as well. But in those 3 games, he caught 16 of 22 targets for 171 yards and 3 touchdowns. And then Chris Olave had a great rookie season with, I guess they're earning their receiving grades. I don't know how their receiving grades work, but he had an 82.9 PFF receiving grade, and then Rashid Shaheed averaged 17.4 yards reception as their deep threat, obviously. So, I take that in a little surprised as that he was ranked that low. But they don't mention like Alvin Kamara as being a receiver. And I know this is wide receiver receiving for him, so you're thinking wide receiver, but I'm just saying this because he didn't leave this out when talking about any of the other rankings, all the people rated above him, and I'll go through that in a second. But he didn't mention like Foster Monroe or Juwan Johnson or Alvin Kamara as being additions to what makes their receiving core better, or parts, or being part of their receiving core. So I'll just go. So the Saints were 21, and then I'll go to the New York Jets. I'm not going to read off exactly what he says, but I'll highlight if he mentions a wide receiver or a wide receiver, a tight end, or a running back in his arguments here. So at 20, he had the New York Jets. But we obviously know they have Garrett Wilson, who, you could flip a coin on who if so he played in the same amount of game. He played in every game, I think, for the New York Jets last year. And then Chris Olave missed like 2 games, but they ended up having like the exact same stats. So, I believe if Chris Olave would have played in all 17 games, he would have been the offensive rookie of the year. So, but anyways, like I said, you flip a coin on Garrett Wilson or Chris Olave. So he has Garrett Wilson mentioned, and PFF, they have him with an 85.9 receiving grade. So it's just like than 3 more than Olave's, which is probably just for the 2, 3 more games that he played in. But the other receivers are like Alan Lazard, Mecole Hardman, Corey Davis, Denzel Mims, Randall Cobb. So those are most of those guys are like second, third, fourth options, or should be in the retirement home with Randall Cobb. But then he does throw in. He mentions C.J. Uzama and Tyler Conklin. They mentions their tight ends, but he didn't mention any. He didn't mention Foster Monroe or Juwan Johnson, who I would say are better than C.J. Uzama and Tyler Conklin. And on his ranking here, I'm surprised he didn't mention Brian Breesy, because even though Brian Breesy, I'll admit, in his first 11 dozen games that he played, he did look amazing running the ball. But for some reason, everyone thinks that he's just going to, after tearing his ACL, he had a lower leg injury or some serious lower leg injury of some sort. They think that Brian Breesy is just going to come back and be just as good as he was before he tore or popped whatever he did. So I could see the Saints above the Jets easily, because I mean, really, they have Garrett Wilson, which the Saints have Chris Olave, and that's pretty much it. And then at 19, they had the Washington Commanders. And anyone that knows anything about the Washington Commanders is Terry McLaurin, who is another Ohio State stud, is a beast. Like he's one of the most underrated wide receivers in the league, So, so they have him as their one receiver, and then they have John Dotson as the number 2, and then we know who Curtis Samuels is. They have Curtis Samuels, and so they mentioned all those guys. All those guys, Terry McLaurin, John Dotson, Curtis Martin. I would admit that those guys were pretty equal to Michael Thomas, Rashid Shaheed, Chris Olave. Like, that's a pretty equal to actual receiving group. But then, like, once again, they didn't mention the tight ends or the running backs for the New Orleans, kind of giving them a leg up on the Saints, not mentioning those guys. But they mentioned Logan Thomas, the tight end for the Commanders, and they mentioned Antonio Gibson, the running back for the Commanders. You can't tell me Antonio Gibson is a better receiver out of the backfield than the New Orleans Saints. So I would kind of say that they're kind of even with the Washington Commanders. And then at 18, we have the Pittsburgh Steelers, and we see Washington. Let's see. Yeah, so we know the Pittsburgh Steelers here at 18. We know who their number 1 guy is, because we had him mixed up with a receiver the Saints signed earlier in the offseason, and James Washington. So Deontay Johnson is not James Washington, but Deontay Johnson is a good receiver. He's a guy that's had 1,000 yards the last couple of years, and then they had rookie George Pickens, who was promising last year, and then they had Allen Robinson, who was kind of a dud with the Rams last year. And then, but so all those guys, once again, all those guys kind of equal up with the Saints and their receivers. But then they added tight end Pat Freiermuth, and who had 700 yards receiving in 2022, which Juwan Johnson had like 500 yards receiving and 8 touchdowns last year. So I'd say they're just about equal. So once again, I would say the Saints are just about equal with the Pittsburgh Steelers. And we have at 17, they have the Denver Broncos. And with their receivers, they have Cortland Sutton, Jerry Jeudy, Tim Patrick, and Greg Dolichi. But see, I'll give them credit. So Sean Payton's squad here, with their rankings for them on the PFF, they're not mentioning any of their tight ends or their running backs. But I would say just health wise, Jerry Jeudy and Cortland Sutton are probably a safer bet than Michael Thomas and Chris Olave. So I can kind of see where they're kind of moving towards that. So I could see where maybe the Denver Broncos are better than the Saints. But then here you have at 16, you have the Jaguars, and once again they're back to stuff that doesn't really make sense in their ranking. So the first receiver they mention in this ranking is Calvin Ridley, who's been like gone for the last year and a half with personal issues and being suspended for gambling. So they mention him, added to the group of Christian Kirk, who was paid like a ridiculous contract last year, but actually did have 1,000 yards this season or last season, 2022. But then they mentioned Evan Ingram, the ex-tight end for the Giants, and then Zay Jones, who was a receiver, was actually one of Derek Carr's favorite receivers last year. So I would put the Saints pretty probably even with the Jacksonville Jaguars at 16. And like I said, they throw in Evan Ingram and a guy that hasn't played in a year and a half. And this one is probably funny as well. I could see the Saints being here at 15 as well. And that's with the Baltimore Ravens. And once again, the first wide receiver they mentioned is Odell Beckham Jr., a guy that hasn't played in an entire year and is in his 30s. And they mentioned Rashad Bateman, who was decent last year. And then the next person they mentioned is a tight end, Mark Andrews. And I'll admit, Mark Andrews is probably a top 5 tight end. So I can see where you put him over Foster Monroe, Juwan Johnson. And then they're talking about a rookie. I think Zay Flowers. Didn't Zay Flowers? He was a rookie. He was drafted this year, wasn't he? Yeah, so and the other receiver that they're mentioning after they mentioned the guy that hasn't played for a year, they mentioned the tight end, and then they're mentioning a rookie from the 2023 draft. So I could put the Saints. The only one so far that I could really say that would probably be above the Saints out of this list going up would be the 2017 Denver Broncos. But I put the Saints ahead of the Jaguars and the Baltimore Ravens. Once I get to a point where I don't think the Saints are any better than these teams, then I'll maybe stop because this list is going long here with the players that I think are better. So then they have the Los Angeles Rams, and they're only mentioning like a couple players here. So they're mentioning Cooper Kupp, who's coming back from like his second ACL injury in his career. So I give you credit, Cooper Kupp had an amazing season in 2021 and they won the Super Bowl and all, but you can't rely that much on a receiver coming back from season-ending injuries, and the other receiver they mentioned is Van Jefferson, who I guess is an okay player. And then they mentioned a tight end in Tyler Higbee. So, I mean, top level Cooper Kupp, and then just everybody else would be a pretty good ranking. But you could say the same thing about the Saints with Michael Thomas. You could just get top level Michael Thomas and everyone else, and you would see the Saints higher on this list. So now, I could see the Saints all the way up to 14, honestly. It wouldn't be that much to argue with. I think we're almost to where the Saints can't really argue. too much. We're getting close here. In the top 15. They should definitely be in the top 15, if nothing else, not all the way down at 21. So next one is at 13, we have the Chicago Bears. And they had last year, they had Chase Claypool, who they traded for, and Darnell Mooney, and then of course they mentioned Cole Clement. Once again, it's just like, why didn't they mention the Saints receiving tight ends or receiving running backs? So Chase Claypool, I think he was like a disappointment for them last year, and I think Darnell Mooney maybe had like just barely 1,000 yards, and then they made a trade for DJ Moore from the Panthers. So, this one's kind of hard to argue. If you get a healthy DJ Moore and a healthy Darnell Mooney, you possibly have two 1,000-yard receivers, and then Chase Claypool in his rookie season had like 10 touchdowns. If he could get like back to that, I guess you could maybe argue that the Chicago Bears are above the Saints in wide receiver core, receiving core. So that one could argue, definitely argue, but I think we're getting to the point where it's not really much of an argue anymore. I'll just name off the players here, and this pretty much gives it away. So at 12 we have, and then there's one more on here that I can argue with. That's a little ridiculous. So at 12 we have the Los Angeles Chargers, and I can just name off the names. A healthy Keenan Allen and Mike Williams, who, both of them have missed some times over the last 3 years, but they're pretty good. And then you have Quentin Johnston and Gerald Everett. I think Gerald Everett's a tight end, and they also mentioned Austin Eckler. And I think I want to say Austin Eckler caught like 100 passes or something ridiculous last yard for them. So no real argument that the Chargers are above the Saints in this list. The only thing that bothers me is that they mention their tight ends and their receivers as if the Saints don't have great receiving tight ends and receivers. And that leads me directly to this point with number 11 being the Kansas City Chiefs, because the first player they mention is Travis Kelce, who's the tight end. And then you got these other guys. I'll give it to you. Kadarius Toney, he balled out in the playoffs, but over his career with the Giants and prior to any of the playoffs with the Kansas City Chiefs, he didn't do anything. And he hasn't shown that he can be healthy either. Then you got Sky Moore, who was okay last year. Marquez Valdes-Scantling, who was okay for them last year as a deep threat. And then they mentioned Jared McKinnon, who's a running back. I definitely don't agree that the Chiefs should be up at 11. Saints should be ahead of them just because they don't have any receivers. They got like no name receivers, they're all guys that could potentially be good, but I wouldn't put too much faith in them. The reason they're such a good and reliable receiving core is because of Travis Kelce, who is a tight end. All right. Getting into the top 10, and I think I'm just going to go through the receivers here because I don't think the Saints could top any of these teams after possibly being all the way at 11 above the Kansas City Chiefs, just out the top 10, and that all just relies on and is dependent on how healthy the team is. But at 10, you have the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, which that's pretty obvious, with Mike Evans and Chris Godwin, guys that have had like 1,000-yard receiving every year for like the last 3 or 4, 5 seasons. I think Mike Evans has had 1,000-yard receiving like every year, and he's going into like his 9th or 10th season. So that's not a hard one to argue. And then you got the Buffalo Bills, who have Stephon Diggs and Gabe Davis. Gabe Davis was a good deep threat there for a little while. And then obviously Stephon Diggs, when he's not being a diva wide receiver or complaining how the organization is run, he's a top 5 receiver. And then Las Vegas, you have obviously you have Devontae Adams, who's been one of the top wide receivers the last 3 years or so. And then obviously they still have Hunter Renfrow, a player that the Saints may be trying to get, and then they also acquired Jacoby Myers, who was like the best wide receiver last year for the Patriots. So they got people. And then they just have like the obvious ones here. Minnesota Vikings, they have Justin Jefferson. So that's pretty much all you got to say about that one. And but basically, arguably the best wide receiver in the league. It's one behind Jamar Chase or with Jamar Chase. And then the Dallas Cowboys have during the offseason, they acquired Brandon Cooks. So, Brandon Cooks has kind of a similar career to Mike Evans, other than a couple of years where he missed some games due to injuries or concussions. He's had pretty much 1,000 yards receiving everywhere he's gone. He's been traded like 5-6 times in his career. But yeah, so you got Brandon Cooks. If he's healthy, he'll probably get you 1,000 yards. And then CeeDee Lamb is starting to show that he's a top wide receiver. But the same with these last couple I've gone over. Let's see, 8 on 9 they mentioned. Let's see here. At 9 with the Bills, they mentioned Dalton Kincaid, a rookie tight end. With the Las Vegas Raiders, they mentioned Austin Hooper, ex-Falcon, and rookie tight end Michael Mayer and Josh Jacobs, running back. And then on Minnesota, they mentioned TJ Hawkinson. And then Jordan Addison, a rookie. And at Dallas, they mentioned, I guess they didn't mention any of the tight ends or other players there, but just kind of going rehashing where on these lists they're talking about tight ends and running backs while it's supposed to be a receiving list. And then Seahawks, that's a pretty obvious one that they're top the Saints in the top 5 here with DK Metcalf, Tyler Lockett, like perennial 1,000-yard receivers. And then they draft arguably the best wide receiver in the 2023 draft and Jackson Smith and Jigba, an Ohio State standout. So can't argue that at all. Then we have the San Francisco 49ers who have Deebo Samuels, Brandon Ayuk. So those receivers there, when healthy and compared to the Saints, probably even, that's with relying on the Saints receivers to be 100% healthy. But Deebo Samuel and Brandon Ayuk have shown that they are reliable in that facet of the game. But of course, on this list, they mentioned George Kittle, who's one of the best tight ends in the league, but he's a tight end, not a wide receiver. And then they mentioned Christian McCaffrey, who's one of the best receiving running backs in the league, similar to Alvin Kamara, which I understand Alvin Kamara may be suspended for a couple games. And then we're getting up into the top 3 here, and this is just can't even argue this list anymore. Like I said, once you got kind of in the top 10, you couldn't really argue the list anymore. But they had Tyreek Hill and Jalen Waddle. Like both those guys looked like they were on pace to have like 1,600 plus receiving yards last year before Tua Tagovailoa got hurt. But they don't mention any of their tight ends or anything. I guess they lost Mike Gesicki in the offseason and Trent Sherfield. They don't really mention any. You don't really have to mention any other receivers when you got Tyreek Hill, receiving options, that is. When you have Tyreek Hill and Jalen Waddle. Then with Philadelphia Eagles, they have A.J. Brown, who is an elite player, and Devontae Smith, who, could become an elite player. Was a Heisman Trophy winner, had 1,300 yards receiving. But, just like all these other lists, they also mentioned Dallas Goedert, who's one of the best receivers in the league, tight end receivers in the league. And that was number 2. And then finally, number 1, which this is just like I said, since they got into the top 10, can't even argue this list anymore because they have, and these are wide receivers. These aren't tight ends or running backs, but they have Jamar Chase as your number 1, T. Higgins as your number 2, and Tyler Boyd as your slot receiver. Like any one of those players would start on the Saints. And then they mentioned Ivan Irvin Smith Jr. and uh, Joe Mixon, the tight end and the running back, Smith Jr. and Joe Mixon. So, you know, this list, I could have moved the Saints up. Let's see. 10. I could have moved the Saints up 10 spots, but once you get in the top 10, there really wasn't much to argue. But it's the Saints off season. Training camp will be here pretty soon. There's, as you can see, with me going through an article like that, there's not a lot to talk about right now. But during this time period, that's probably a good thing because with Saints history and anyone that's followed that, if there's some big news story swirling the Saints around this time, it's probably something bad. But anyways, I think that's all I have for you this evening. So with that, can I get a menu?